All right. Hey, so for those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Joe. My wife and I, Irene, she's over there. All right. So we are continuing on in our First Corinthians message series, okay? And we are on week 2, okay? So we're going to cover the second half of chapter 1. And if you remember, this is the port city of Corinth. And what was Corinth like? The city of Corinth was wealthy, it was pluralistic, and it was sexually immoral, okay? One of the big themes that we're going to see over and over again in 1 Corinthians, over and over again, all throughout the book, is this idea of the reversal of values, reversal of conventional wisdom. And I think it causes us to kind of pause and consider, am I doing what I do in a godly way, according to God's values, or am I doing things in a worldly way, according to worldly values? So in verse 5, Apostle Paul says, he kind of actually is complimenting them here. And he says, you are enriched in all speech and all knowledge. And then in verse 7, you are not lacking in any gift. So these are good things, right? Except actually through the rest of the book, he's going to tell them again and again how they use this for their own benefit, to lift themselves up, to glorify themselves, their speech, their knowledge, and their gifts. And he kind of talks against that kind of worldly way of looking at these good things that God has given us. It's good to be good in speech. It's good to have a lot of knowledge. It's good to have these gifts. But they were kind of trying to seek them out and acquire them for themselves. So in chapter 4, he talks about what it looks like to follow Jesus. It's not like this. It's actually to suffer for him. Chapter 8, he talks about how knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Right? And then, of course, chapter 13 is a famous chapter on love, and he kind of goes through all of that. So we'll see this theme kind of come up again and again. All right, so now starting from verse 12. What I mean is that each of one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ, right? These were the different divisions that were happening in the church. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? Right? He's like, I didn't die for you. Why follow me in that way, right? In that kind of faction way. So I thank God that I baptized none of you except for Crispus and Gaius, so that none of you may say you were baptized in my name. Oh, wait, I did also baptize the household of Stephanus. And then beyond that, I don't know. But anyway, for Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. So he's addressing the divisions, right? And so I just, before we move on, I just kind of wanted to make 2 quick digressions, okay? So this whole thing about baptizing, I did not baptize, I baptized none of you. So this is a good verse to show people who say that you must be baptized to be saved, okay? Now, you may have never run into some of these groups, but there are some groups actually even on our campus that tell us that we have to do that, and in fact, that we have to be baptized with their church. And so they'll ask you have you been baptized? And even if you've been baptized, you have to be baptized with our church. So if you've ever had encounters with those people, you can point them to this verse, because if you have to be baptized to be saved, this would be a very odd thing for Apostle Paul to say, right? I'm glad I didn't baptize any of you. Wait, what a minute? What, right? Yeah, because, and then he says, Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. That is the main thing. Right? To preach the gospel. Now, to kind of round that out a little bit, it is also true that Christ commanded us to be baptized. So if you are saved, you should be baptized. That is a command that God gives us, but it's not what saves us, okay? So, all right. Now, digression number 2, I just thought it was funny how this letter was written. So Apostle Paul didn't have Microsoft Word, kind of typing out on a word processor and delete. He was just telling a scribe to write this letter, right? So he's like, I didn't baptize any of you. Oh yeah, except for Crispus and Gaius. Oh yeah, and except for Stephanus. And then I don't even remember. Oh, but that's not the point, right? So he's kind of writing this. So anyway, I just thought it was funny, and it's sort of a corrective, I think, for a certain way of reading the Bible, which is to minutely analyze every detail, every comma, every tense, the past perfect participle, that sort of style of reading the Bible. There's value there because sometimes that really helps you get to the meaning of the text. But to do that too much, Paul's like, yeah, I did this and this. Oh yeah, and I forgot about this. And it's to get the gist of what the gospel is saying, right? Okay. All right, so let's keep going. So these people, they chose to align themselves with certain leaders, right? I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ. And then we talked about the I follow Christ folks last week, right? So kind of wonder how they divided themselves. Like, can you imagine being part of that church and be like, what group should I join, you know? How would you decide which faction to join? Maybe some people just kind of randomly chose because they just want to hang out with their friends. Whatever you're going to, I'll be part of that faction, right? I would imagine, though, that a lot of it is probably an expression of your own personal distinctive, okay? Because Apostle Paul was a certain flavor, right? There's a certain kind of way that he is. Apollos, like, he was impressive. He came from Alexandria. He was very educated, very learned. They say later that he speaks really well. In fact, there would be speakers from Alexandria who would go around giving speeches, and people would pay them. Like, that was their job, to give a speech, and people were like, wow, that was a great speech. Here's some money. Like, that's sort of what their job was. So he probably had a really powerful kind of oratory ability, right? And then you got the people who, so it's funny, it doesn't say I follow Peter, which is kind of what you'd expect. They say I follow Cephas, because Cephas was the transliteration of the Aramaic, you know, the original. Like, I'm not even going to say Peter, I'm going to say Cephas, you know. So these are probably like Jewish Christians maybe. And they're like, oh, I want to follow like the Jewish guy. And so they're following like through an expression of their personal distinctives. And what Paul says about all of this is, who cares? Who cares? None of this is very important. How do you express your personal distinctive when it comes to your relationships, and especially in the church? Your education, your ethnic background, like, are these the kind of things that you get passionate about? Minor worldly differences. And if that divides you, I think that shows how immature you are, how much the gospel has not penetrated into your values. And I think this can happen at a lot of levels. That personal distinctive, that personal style, personal aesthetic becomes more important than the preaching and living out of the gospel. You see that group of people over there, and you're like, I don't know, man, they're not cool. They're not cool. You know, I don't want to hang out with those folks. Like, or maybe you're like SoCal Korean Christian, and then you look at those folks, and they're like NorCal Chinese Christians, and you're like, I don't know. They can't even, you know, they don't even know K-pop or whatever. You know, like I can't be friends with that person. They're into Taylor Swift. You know, like. He's a Republican, she's a Democrat. We can't. So whatever personal distinctive that you have, if that divides you from other believers, that's just silly. That's just silly. Like, so, okay. And then, so I think this really affects like the way that you see people and how deep you're willing to get into relationships. Like, what prevents you from this from happening? And if it turns out it's just one of these kind of personal distinctives kind of thing, Paul's like, why are you doing that? Don't divide based on that. This can also happen at the church level too, actually. I see a lot of churches starting to divide on some social or political issue, making that the main thing, right? Or some subsection of doctrine and making that the main thing. That's not the main thing. The main thing is the gospel. The main thing is Christ crucified. Like, that's where we have to camp out. And so Paul continues on this theme. For the word of the cross, right? Like the message of the cross, what the cross tells us. This is the gospel, right? The message of the cross. What is it? It's folly. It's folly. To whom? Those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. So this one message, the message of the cross, the message of the gospel, has two reactions to two different kinds of people. It can either be folly, because this is crazy. You're talking crazy stuff. Like, the God of the universe would give up his power, kind of like what Jermaine read from Philippians 2, like that passage. That he would empty himself, make himself nothing. That's the message of the cross, right? And so you can look at that and you can have two reactions. One is, that's foolishness. Why would you give all of that up? Versus, that's the power of God. It's the power to save. And based on your reaction to the message of the cross, humanity divides into two kinds of people. Those who are perishing and those who are being saved. Those are the only two responses that we can have. Those are the only two places that we can be. There's no middle ground. You're going to spend the rest of eternity in heaven with Jesus or away from God in hell. There's no middle ground. How do you see people? It was very clear how Apostle Paul saw people. And it's very clear how Jesus saw people. The thing that Jesus talked about the most was the kingdom of God and how to enter into it. Why is it that we preach the word of the cross? Because that's the only thing that has the power to save. It is the only thing that has the power to save. We don't preach the message of the cross because it's a nice message of God's love, although it is that too. We don't preach the message of the cross because we want people to clean up their lives, although it can do that too. We don't preach the message of the cross because we want people to have good morals and good marriages and good obedient children, although it can do that too. We preach the message of the cross because if you don't accept the message of the cross, then you're going to be perishing. That's the main thing. If Christianity to you is just a better lifestyle, then there's no need to share it with someone who's totally content with their own lives. You know, there are people who are needy, right? Like you've met them and you probably have been there before where you're like, man, like what is life? And you're sort of, failed out of 2 classes or something like that. And you're like, you need something, right? You know, not everyone's there. Sometimes people are just really happy playing 12 hours of video games a day. They just are. They're just, they have enough money and they're just doing fine. What about those people? They need the cross too. Because again, ultimately, you're going to land in one of those 2 places. This is why we've been doing evangelism training, why we're going to continue to do evangelism training for the next 2 weeks. This is why we've done evangelism on the college campus for decades. Okay, I was flying for special talks before a lot of you guys were born. Okay, it's because of this reality. Every single person you meet, they're going one place or the other. I've been doing dining hall outreach every year since I was in college, longer than you guys were born. Why? Why do I do that? I'm still doing that. Why? There's really just one reason. Because everyone we'll meet is going to go one place or another. And I want to meet as many people as we possibly can and share with them the message of the cross. For every 2 people who come, there were probably about 25 who said no, right? There were probably about 25 who were like, nah, this is foolishness. You still believe this stuff? Oh my goodness. And they kind of, to them it's folly. But to some who come, it will become the power of God. And I think this is why it's so tragic when divisions distract people. When divisions distract people. When your personal distinctives becomes more important than this message. We have a mission, right? Our mission is to preach the word of cross to those who are perishing. Paul continues to develop this theme in the next section. He says, where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, right? The world didn't know God through wisdom. It didn't arrive at God through our awesome philosophies. But it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach the main thing, Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men, right? Again, we see the reversal of values, right? What's good? It's good to be strong. It's good to be wise, right? Paul's like, but if that leads you in a wrong place, oh boy. It's the weakness of God. It's the wisdom of God. So again, we see a lot of those contrasts, right? The wisdom of the world and the foolishness of God. So I used to get a lot of worldly wisdom from my dad. He's like he's I don't think any of you guys have like any of your parents would have anything on my dad, because he used to be a professor in Korea, and then when he came to America, like, things happened, and so we lost green card and stuff like that. So we were kind of undocumented for a long time, and so he had to just take whatever job. So he was so intellectually unfulfilled that he just poured it all out on me, man. He just, every lecture that he had, he just poured it out on me. So I used to get like 5-hour lectures regularly. I just sit and like whatever the topic was, like he's like, hey, what do you want to do? Like, what kind of job do you want? I'm like, how old was I? I wasn't even in high school yet. I was like a 13-year-old kid, like, what kind of job do you want? I'm like, I don't know, maybe a teacher. And then he gives me a 5-hour lecture. And then he talks about, like, he gives like the historical understanding of like job, and it shouldn't just be an occupation. It should be like your, like your whatever. And then he gives me some Bible, and he's like, oh, you should do this and whatever. And then he gives me some like Confucian sort of whatever. And then like 5 hours later, like I've had like so he would do this regularly, and he would give me a lot of really good advice, really, really good advice. It was only later that I realized that it comes in conflict with the cross. Because everything that he was telling me to do was to advance myself. This is how you advance yourself. This is how you get better. This is how you achieve in the world. The cross tells us that the greatest being in the universe lowered himself. And then he says to us, come, follow me. We're like, oh, do I want to follow that? This descending, this giving of my life, this I should love other people like I love myself. And so that's when the two wisdoms collide, right? So Paul challenges them. He says, where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of the age? Right? Where are these people? So has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom. The world did not know God through wisdom. You can't get to God by wanting the best for yourself only. You don't get there. All the philosophies of the world, all the amazing thinkers over time, there were like geniuses all throughout history. And they arrived at some pretty awesome philosophies. None of them get to God. The world did not know God through wisdom. It pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. Our world is obsessed with wisdom. The more, I'm not on like YouTube, and I don't even use TikTok or whatever, but it's all about clickbaity titles, right? Clickbaity titles, and like they always promise you like 10 steps or whatever, like 5, like whatever. It's like miniature wisdom, like boom, like right there ready for you, right? But again, none of that gets you to salvation. Human wisdom will always be bent in on itself. Human wisdom is always going to serve the self most of all. How to advance better, how to advance faster. What's the wisdom of God? The first shall be last. What? Steph was saying, like, I want it to always be first. I want it to be the top 10%. Godly wisdom says the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. To serve is to better than to be served. Give yourself as a ransom for many. Make yourself weak so that God can become strong. What? What? This is foolishness, right? This is so counter to the wisdom of the world. The wisdom of God is the cross of Jesus Christ. It's Christ crucified. God put the pattern there for us. I'm going to die for you. Follow me. This is the way to life. In the lens of worldly wisdom, the cross of Christ is utter foolishness. But in the lens of eternity, in terms of perishing and being saved, the cross is the only wise thing. It's the only wise thing. The Jews demanded signs, and the Greeks seek wisdom. So there's these two powerful groups, okay? So this city has all kinds of people in it, right? And so there's these two factions. And he's like, the Jews, they demand signs. They wanted power. They expected the Messiah to come through miraculous means and like with miraculous signs. God, show us a miracle. They wanted to tap into God's power, experience God's power. And I think we can relate to this because we want God's power too, right? We want him to fix our lives. We want him to fix our hearts. We want God to change us. We want God to change our experiences. And we want that to happen now. But if that's what you major in, right? If that's what you're seeking most from God, that's going to keep you from the main thing, which is Christ crucified, right? Christ crucified. We can also see some of these tendencies, I think, in the sort of the ultra charismatics who major in the minors of seeking after signs and power. The Greeks, what do the Greeks do? They seek wisdom. Wisdom. Greek wisdom at the time said that perfection is not changing. And so they thought that if there was a God, he would never interact with humankind. He would just be out there, distant, never changing. And so they see like Christians claiming that God would come down in the flesh, like what in the world? And then that he would die? No way. No way. That's not what God is like. That's not my perspective, my idea of what God would be like. And because God did not fit their wisdom, their perception of what God should do, they rejected him. And I think it's like the people who are so enamored by their own wisdom, by their own thinking. And, you know, even if you're Christian, you're like, yeah, I guess I see your wisdom, God, like it's here in the Bible here, kind of, you know. But I need you to convince me perfectly that I should follow you. Right? Like every single thing that you say, like, that's interesting. And it has to kind of filter through your own wisdom. And God has to work hard to convince you exactly of what you have to do. Right? And again, I think we see this strain in certain parts of Christianity where people major in the minors of minute doctrinal details. Right? Calling out other Christians for misreading a tense in Jeremiah or something like that, right? Now, does God have power? Of course. Does God have wisdom? Of course. Are these things important? Yes, absolutely. But Paul says we need to major in the majors. What is the main thing? What is the main thing? The main thing, the main thing. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. The main thing that we should always be thinking is to keep the main thing the main thing. Christ crucified. Christ crucified. This is the main thing. I think if you want to truly understand the wisdom and power of God, look at Christ crucified. Charles Spurgeon, amazing preacher, they call him the Prince of Preachers. He had this quote, the motto of all true servants of God should be, we preach Christ and him crucified. A sermon without Christ in it is like a loaf of bread without any flour in it. No Christ in your sermon, sir, then go home and never preach again until you have something worth preaching. Like, oh, okay, all right, just make sure I got Christ in here, you know. So Christ crucified, right? That's the main thing. All right, home stretch. Last part of chapter 1. For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And because of him, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness, sanctification, redemption, so that, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. Okay, so verse 26, what is Paul talking about here? Like he's kind of doing a personal appeal. He's talking to them, right? He's like, guys, like you were like not wise, even according to worldly standards, you know? You were not powerful, like you weren't of noble birth. You're like, you know, like low and despised in the world, you know? So it's kind of offensive. So what's going on here? Okay, so here's the city of Corinth, okay? Like this is Google Earth, by the way. So here's Corinth, okay? And So the reason why this was like such an important like port city was because ships would come, okay? And here's like Athens, okay? So Athens is like a major whatever, and so ships would come around here, and if they want to make this trip, they have to go here, right? Except that this part of the sea was incredibly like stormy. Lots of storms, lots of pirates. And so it was much easier to avoid this week or 2 week trip, which is dangerous and piratey, and instead go through here to Corinth, okay? Now, the problem, though, is that there, okay, yes, okay, all right. So the problem, though, okay, so this is current, so this used to not be here, this canal. But anyway, the problem was, so this would be the port, and what they would do is this is a 3.5 mile stretch right here. And so what the city of Corinth would do is that they would unload your ship for a fee. They would cart your stuff over 3.5 miles for a fee, right? And then they would rent a boat from here to Athens, which is really close, for a fee. But that's still way better than going all the way around, right? Because this trip is like half a day, and like it's just much faster, it's much safer. And so this is why Corinth became incredibly rich. It's just an easy way to get through, right? So it was a powerhouse in 600 BC. In 146 BC, Corinth was destroyed in the Achaean War. Okay, Rome just lit the whole city on fire, and they left it. They just left it like that for 100 years. Julius Caesar, 44 BC, he looked at the city and is like, wait a minute, this is a great location. So he rebuilds it. He's like, what are we doing? We should use the city. So he rebuilds it and he makes a general invitation. Hey, anyone who wants to go out to the wild, wild Corinth and rebuild, go ahead and go. So what kind of people would go? It's not the people who are established, right? I mean, if you're established, you're not going to go to some random city that was like lit on fire that you have to rebuild. You know, the people who are going to go are the people who are like, dude, like, I'm down on my luck. I'm going to try something. Within 70 years, by 30 AD, Jesus' time, this city is booming again. Crazy rich. So, huge commercial center. So, what is the city filled with? People who are not of noble birth. People who are low and despised who are like, dude, I'm gonna try. And they go, and now the city is full of people who are rich. Newly rich, and then of course people who are still poor. And we see those conflicts kind of coming up later on. Now this is a generalization, of course, but I think one pattern you see in those who become like rich quick, crypto again, or like lottery ticket winners, like, of course this is a generalization, but like what do they tend to do with their money? Just, right? Like ostentatious, like really nice flashy car, really tacky clothes or whatever, right? Like they just want to show off a little bit of their money, right? And so there's sort of a distancing of anything that maybe they would consider low class now at this point. And we'll see in future chapters that actually what they started to do was consider Apostle Paul low class. Anything that reminds them of their lowly background, right? Because, he still had to like work, like he was a tent maker. He's like, oh man, he's still doing manual labor, like he doesn't even charge for his speeches. Like all these other guys from Alexandria, they charge for their speeches because they're good, but he doesn't even charge for his speeches. Like, it's sort of that kind of thing. And he's saying, God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. And so again, it's all that the values are flipping, the worldly wisdom, the worldly, like all of this. So I wonder how many of us are kind of like the Corinthians in that when we're chasing after the world, it's not just because we're greedy, but because we're driven by insecurities. You sort of want to prove yourself. You want to prove yourself. The world says you need to fill up those insecurities by making something of yourself, and thus all of that worldly wisdom. God says, those who are lowly and despised, come to me, and I'll use that. I'll use that, and I'll use that in power, and I'll shame all of the halls of power. I really like this poem, I don't know, essay maybe. It's called One Solitary Life. It's about Jesus' life. He's talking about Jesus. And I think it describes us well. Jesus was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in still another village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family or owned a house. He did not go to college. He never visited a big city. He never traveled 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of these things one usually associates with greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. He was turned over to his enemies, and he went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his clothing, the only property he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. This is Jesus' life. 19 centuries have come and gone, and today he remains the central figure of the human race and the leader of mankind's progress. All the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all parliaments that have ever sat, all the kings that have ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man on this planet so much as that one solitary life. God takes the lowly and despised, and he shames the strong. The history of the world is written through people who follow Jesus, through people who are carrying their crosses daily and following him. It doesn't come in the halls of power. It doesn't come in the corner office of a Wall Street building or Hollywood or whatever worldly wisdom would say that you should chase. It comes through Christ crucified. It's the only way to salvation. It's the only way to have a restored relationship with God. And that life with Jesus starts now and lasts forever. And so, if you're at the winter retreat, the last session was on revivals on campus, right? And so you guys got like D.L. Moody, right? One of the greatest preachers who ever lived, who people would come to make fun of his accent because he couldn't pronounce things properly. He was kind of a redneck. And yet, by the third day, they all became saved. Like, history changes through people like that. History changes through people like C.T. Studd, who had an incredibly lucrative sports career right in front of him, kind of like a Steph Curry equivalent. And he says, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go to China and be a missionary. Gave up his life, descended just like Jesus. He says, I'm going to give it for this reason. And history changes because of people like that. You have untold number of people on those campuses, right? All of those revivals on campuses. All of those people who are doing the regular stuff of Bible studies, prayer meetings, sharing the gospel with their friends. History changes through people who do things like that. That's the power and the wisdom of God. And I hope that as you think about everything that the world tells you to do, and then suddenly what the cross tells you to do, and this looks crazy, this looks foolish, and this looks really smart. And put those two things next to each other, and Paul would say, man, this is what changes the world. This is the power of God. All right, let's pray. Lord, I thank you so much for your word. I thank you, Lord, that you chose us, though we were not of noble birth and we were lowly and despised. But through us, you wanted to show your power. And Lord, I pray that we would continue to do that. We would continue to show you through our lives, through the choices that we make, not by following after the worldly wisdom, Lord, but the wisdom of the cross. And may we keep that main thing, always the main thing. We pray also in your name. Amen.